A very good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us in this webinar on proof of documents in a civil trial. Today we'll be having a conversation with Mr. Rohan Sathye, counsel of the Bombay High Court. And we will be firstly discussing various type of documents as to how we prove them in a civil trial. And later on we'll take your questions and answers. Firstly, let me welcome, firstly before I welcome Mr. Sathye, I will just put in a disclaimer. All information contained in these pages is for educational and informational purposes only. It should not be considered legal advice. Please consult a lawyer before taking any steps based on this information. So let me welcome first Mr. Rohan Sathye, who is a qualified solicitor and presently exclusively practices as a counsel in the Bombay High Court, the City Civil Court, and also appears in the NCLT and is also engaged in a variety of arbitrations. Welcome, Rohan.
Thank you, Makaran. Am I audible to everyone?
We can hear you.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you.
My name is Makaran Bakore. I'm a partner in JMB Partners, and we deal with civil litigation in various fora, including the Bombay High Court and other courts. So the topics we will be covering in this webinar are basically various concepts related to proving of documents, then proving of original documents and their photocopies, documents requiring attestation, newspaper reports, public documents, documents obtained under RTI, which is becoming more and more common, and how to draft an effective affidavit of evidence. Though, as I said, the format will be that we will be having a discussion on the various topics followed by question and answer. In the question and answer session, you can type your questions in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And the link to the BEAR Act, I've put it in the chat box. So at any point of time, you need to refer to the provisions. You can click on the link. It will open a PDF file and you can refer to the provisions. So Rohan, would you like to make some opening remarks before we move to the key concepts on proving the documents?
Firstly, thank you for a very kind introduction, Makaran. Before we begin, all that I would want to say is that the focus of today's webinar, though it would be in that sense an overview of most of the applicable provisions and how one can implement them in everyday practice, would be to touch upon what is essentially known as proof of documents. So the focus today is not only on the admissibility of a document in a civil trial, as at what would happen at the stage of admitting a document in evidence, but it goes a little further insofar as how a document once admitted would be considered to be either proved or sufficiently proved so as to enable a court or a tribunal or an arbitrator or whichever forum it may be to...
Rohan, sorry to interrupt you. Can you speak up a little bit?
Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, sure. So the focus really would be on trying to go a little further beyond the admissibility of a document and into the proof of a document so as to reach a threshold where a court would then be able to take cognizance of that document and come to a conclusion one way or the other by looking at a particular document or a set of documents. So today's webinar is not only limited to admissibility, is what I wanted to just clarify. And as we all know that litigation is ultimately a matter of strategy. So what one would bring in and not bring in is all a question which will turn on the facts and circumstances of each case. So I would not get into all that. Pure and simple theory is what we would try and discuss today and limit ourselves to proof of documents.
Okay. Thank you, Rohan. Now, I think some of the key concepts which will apply to probably all documents and evidence, are what is proved, disproved, and not proved. Can you quickly tell us what these three concepts are and what is their significance in the Evidence Act?
Sure. I would request everyone to have a look at a copy of the Evidence Act if available handy in physical form, or the e-version that Makarand has circulated. We would find the definition of these three terms under Section 3, as we all know. Just to broadly touch upon the distinguishing factors in that sense amongst the three terms, is that what we need to today understand and keep in mind is that a court would necessarily apply the prudent man's test when it has to look at a particular set of facts and decide whether those facts have been either proved, disproved, or not proved. The essence is that the court will test each document or each fact on the threshold of the prudent man's test, and which essentially means that whether the court believes that a particular fact exists or considers its existence so probable that a prudent man would then, under circumstances of the existence of such a fact, act on and do his or her own dealings. So that's broadly the understanding. If we just have a look at the definition of proved, disproved, and not proved, the essential distinction is this: when a fact is said to be proved is when a court, after considering the matters before it, either believes it to exist or considers its existence so probable that a prudent man ought, under the circumstances of a particular case, to act upon the supposition that it exists. The definition of disproved is the exact opposite of proved, so we may not spend too much time over it. And not proved is when a fact is neither proved nor disproved. So one will have to keep these niceties in mind when either tendering any document in evidence, because ultimately a document is a reflection of the facts that it so enumerates. We could go to the next set of the terms.
Next set of concepts are again may presume, shall presume, and conclusive proof.
Yes, so even these three concepts are critical because under the Evidence Act, there are certain presumptions given to the existence or non-existence of certain facts vis-a-vis certain documents, etc., which we will come to at a later stage. But for that, one needs to understand the meaning of the terms may presume, shall presume, and conclusive proof. The essential difference, and one would find it in Section 4 of the Evidence Act, is that when a fact is said, when it is said that the court may presume the existence of a certain fact, it essentially means that it will regard that such fact is proved unless and until it is disproved, or may call upon the party who seeks to take benefit of such a presumption to prove it. So essentially it means that to begin with, the court will consider a particular fact that, okay, fine, it is proved because there is a presumption. However, it is upon the other side who intends to disprove such a fact to lead his or her own evidence and then attempt to disprove such a fact. Additionally, the court can also call upon the person who's trying to take benefit of this presumption to lead his own evidence to prove it irrespective of the presumption. Which is the exact distinction rather between what is may presume and shall presume. When the term shall presume is used in the Act, it effectively means that the court shall presume the existence of a fact. However, the other side who intends to disprove such a fact can lead evidence to actually disprove it. However, there is no burden on the party who seeks to rely on such a presumption to actually lead any further evidence to say that such a fact is in itself in existence, or the court can never call upon a party who wishes to rely upon such a presumption to lead any further evidence to say or to make out a case as to how the fact in fact exists or is proved. Conclusive proof is the third category. In this, I would like to just read the definition because it's kind of self-explanatory. When one fact is declared by this Act to be conclusive proof of another, the court shall, on proof of the one fact, regard the other as proof, and shall not allow evidence to be given for the purpose of disproving it. So effectively, when one fact is said to be conclusive proof of the other, then once that other fact is proved, then the fact which is considered to be a conclusive proof is indirectly proved by the existence of such a fact. And the court will not allow any further evidence or rebuttal evidence or whatever one may call it to be led by the other side to disprove such a fact. This becomes critical. Just to give one example at the top of my head would be Section 68 of the Indian Partnership Act, which provides or rather gives a presumption of conclusive proof to entries made when a partnership firm is registered with the ROF. Such entries will have evidentiary value rather, and would be conclusive proof of the contents of such entries insofar as inter se between the partners, that is inter se between the persons on whose behalf these entries have been registered with the ROF. This becomes critical because once an entry is then tendered in court and admitted in evidence, and the court once looks at the entries, there can be no other evidence which can be led by these individuals to try and disprove the contents of these entries. This is just one example. There is a lot of law on this, etc., but we need not get into it at this stage, but just to give a brief background.
Yes, and going ahead, sometimes in the court we see at the stage of admission and denial that the lawyer says that this document is not admissible, or I admit the document but not the contents or the truth of contents. Can you throw some lights on these various aspects of a document that have to be considered while proving them?
Yes, sure. So effectively, the concepts that one will need to keep in mind is relevancy and admissibility. Now, relevancy, as we all know, is dealt with under Chapter 2 of the Evidence Act. I need not get too much into it. Section 5, just to touch upon it. Section 5 essentially says that evidence may be given in any suit or proceeding of the existence or non-existence of every fact in issue, and of such other facts as are hereinafter declared to be relevant, and of no others. So the critical words here are and of no others. So effectively, we all know that evidence needs to be given of every fact in issue and other background or surrounding facts which are considered to be relevant under Chapter 2 of the Act. That being apart, no other facts can be proved in a civil trial. So this becomes critical because this will ultimately boil down to which facts are considered to be relevant by law and which are not. So at this stage, once a document at the stage of admissibility obviously need not be tested on the thresholds of relevancy, but once the final hearing of a suit starts and the judge is required to apply his judicial mind and test each document on its own thresholds, is when this issue of relevancy comes in. And admissibility, as we all know, is again restricted to whether a document is per se admissible in law or not as evidence. And those thresholds are quite straightforward in the sense this gets covered once documents are to be marked. And after that stage, once there is objections taken or not taken, the court will deal with it at the relevant stage. But admissibility as a standard threshold will get covered before the hearing of the suit. Obviously, if objections are taken and if documents are marked subject to the objection or subject or only for identification, etc., then all those will be decided at the final hearing threshold. Then we come to proof of execution, proof of contents, and proof of truth of contents. Now, this is critical because while execution of a document is simpliciter the fact that the document is in existence, and if it is signed by a party, it is so signed. So proving this signature and the fact that a pen was put to paper and the document was signed means that a document is proved to have been executed and it's in existence. What the document will contain, as in what would be the contents of the document, would be the actual facts which are mentioned in the document. And then the truth of the contents would be one step further. So just to give a very general example, if a letter is addressed by A to B, in which A mentions that he has engaged a particular firm, say XYZ, and company as chartered accountants to audit his books of account for a particular year. And that while engaging with this firm, he realizes that one of the partners of this firm who he's dealing with turns out to be thoroughly incompetent. And he's actually mentioned that in the letter, that I found Mr. So-and-so to be thoroughly incompetent. He's not done a good job, etc., etc. Now, this letter is signed by A, sent to B. In this situation, the fact that A has signed the letter and that he acknowledges and admits to his signature would mean that the existence and execution of the letter is proved. Proof of contents would technically mean that the letter in fact says what I have just said. And the truth of the contents would be one step further, where if A is able to lead any other evidence, or for that matter, steps into the box and says, yes, the contents of the letter are true and correct because I know what has happened. And in fact, it is true and correct that Mr. So-and-so, who's the partner of the firm, was thoroughly incompetent, etc. Then the contents of the letter would be proved. So here the thresholds would be execution, contents, and then truth of contents. For proving truth of contents, it would be necessary that the author of the document or someone who's aware of the transaction steps into the witness box and then makes a statement that the contents are true because of his personal knowledge. Just to highlight this, there is an old judgment of the Bombay High Court. I think it's Justice Bharucha's judgment. Off the top of my head, the citation would be, I think, AIR 1983 Bombay 1, which clearly distinguishes between these three concepts and lays down what is the exact difference between the three.
Yes. Now, last concept is that of the rule of best evidence.
Yes. Even this is quite relevant, where for proving a particular fact, the best evidence that is available must be produced. In the context of documents, it primarily means that the original document must be tendered in evidence for the examination by the court. The original document would necessarily mean the primary evidence which is available. Secondly, it also means that such primary evidence must be proved by the author of the document, that is the person who's actually executed the document, or for that matter is a signatory to the agreement, as the case may be. And in the absence of such an author, that is, if the person is simply dead or can't be physically located or for some other reasons, whatever it may be, at least someone who's aware of the entire transaction, etc. However, the best evidence rule essentially signifies that the author of the document, or as we've said, the person who's executed the document, must be examined to prove the contents of the document. Once that is done, the criteria of the best evidence rule would be satisfied, broadly.
Before we go to documentary evidence, can you explain a little bit about oral and documentary evidence and primary and secondary evidence?
I guess the first categorization is quite clear. I need not spend too much time on it. Oral evidence is the evidence which is not backed up by any documentary evidence, where the witness steps into the box and now, obviously through his evidence affidavit, makes statements to his own personal knowledge or otherwise. Whereas documentary evidence would be the tendering of a physical document for the examination by the court. Moving on to primary and secondary evidence, these concepts are critical when it comes to documentary evidence. Primary evidence, as we've already spoken about, is the actual document being submitted for examination. And secondary evidence is covered under sections 63 onwards, 63, 64, 65. Section 63 provides the various categories like certified copies, copies made from original with a mechanical process to ensure the accuracy and authenticity of the copy and compared with the original. Then other copies made from and compared with the original, or counterparts of documents, or oral accounts of the contents of documents given by some person who's seen such a document. These are broadly the categories. One can have a look at section 63 to consider it.
Okay. So are there any facts that require no proof at all? In what cases do we not need to lead any evidence?
Right. In this case, as we all can see on the slide, the principle of law is enunciated in sections 56 to 58. The effective logic being that there are certain facts which are so obvious that a court need not expect a litigant to actually prove them, and of which the court can take judicial notice. Under section 57, there are a list of things of which the court will take judicial notice, such as enactments prevalent in India as also in various states, then all public acts passed, etc., etc. Then rules of actually traffic, then geographical time zones and things like that, then rules of the sea, etc., navigation. All these can be considered by the court and taken judicial notice of. However, there is one critical element which needs to be considered, and that is section 58, which provides for facts admitted need not be proved. I would just like to quickly go through section 58 because I think it's quite important. No fact need be proved in any proceeding which the parties thereto or their agents agree to admit at the hearing, or which before the hearing they agree to admit by any writing under their hands, or which by any rule of pleading in force at the time they are deemed to have been admitted by their pleadings, provided that the court may in its discretion require the facts admitted to be proved otherwise than by such admissions. So it is quite clear that where facts have been admitted by the other side, it might be at the stage of admission denial of documents, or a little before that when pleadings are filed, or even before that stage, then a party who intends to rely on such facts or rely on such documents need not prove such facts or documents. The essence being to curtail the scope of the trial and not to spend time over things that have already been admitted by the other side. The critical element here would also be that the scope of section 58 is also relevant when one looks at the admissions. The admissions may be made by the parties or their agents and may also be covered under any rule of pleading. So as an instance, it would, for example, under Order 12 Rule 6, when a party is trying to obtain a decree on admission, where someone has admitted the pleadings of the plaintiff and the plaintiff intends to move for a decree on admission, it would in that sense principally be covered here, though not directly as a flow of 58, but the principle enunciated is more or less the same.
With that background, we can start with the most basic document, which is proving of original private documents. For example, proving an original agreement or a memorandum of understanding or multi-party contracts, or even correspondence that is sent and received by one person, or proving third-party correspondence. So in this, firstly, we have to, as Rohan has said, need to prove existence and execution. And after that, the contents and truth of contents. Rohan, can you throw some lights on these points insofar as the original private documents are concerned?
Sure. So the category that appears from this slide is basically documents that are original documents and private documents. I believe in the examples, Makarand has covered an original agreement. So basically any contract entered into by two or more parties, which could be an MOU, a multi-party contract, whatever it may be. So it effectively means a document that is signed by two or more parties, and correspondence sent and received as also third-party correspondence. So I would take the example of a simple letter sent by A to B or something like that. So how would one go about proving the existence and the execution? So the answer is quite simple. In cases, first let's take an agreement. In cases of an agreement where two or more people have signed the document, the party who intends to rely on the agreement and prove it must set out in his or her evidence affidavit that the agreement was executed on so-and-so date, that he's actually signed the document, he's admitting his signature, identifying it, as also initials if there are any on each page, as also the signature on the last page, which is quite clear. As also the fact that he has seen the other parties to the agreement actually sign and initial the document. He's identified those signatures and that they were present physically at one location when the signatures were done and the execution took place. These are some of the basic averments that would be required insofar as proving the existence and execution of the document is concerned. Whereas for proving the contents and truth of contents, as I have already spoken about earlier, the party who is a party to the agreement, once when leads evidence, will clearly state that he's aware of the document, he's aware of the contents of the document, he's gone through it, and the fact that he's also aware of the underlying transaction and that the contents of the document are true and correct. On these lines, if averments are made, then contents of the documents as also the truth of such contents would be proved. Now, essentially, there would be a slight distinction when it comes to an agreement, which is a bi-party or a multi-party contract, and a letter which is sent by one party to the other. In cases of a letter which is sent by you to someone else and you wish to prove it, obviously the original won't be in your possession. So the whole issue of addressing notice to produce, etc., will come in, which we will deal with at the secondary evidence. You may also send in evidence of office copy which you must have maintained, and then again prove the signature, which would be your signature, I take it, assuming that the author of the document is leading evidence. And on proving signature, it would be clear enough that the existence and execution is proved. As far as the contents are concerned, again, since you're aware of the transaction, you can make statements in the evidence affidavit which go on to say that you're aware of the contents and admit and state that the same are true and correct. As far as correspondence received by you is concerned, now that would depend on the facts and circumstances of each case and how you would want to treat a correspondence that you've received. Obviously, there would be ideally, as a fair trial principle, no question of denying receipt if you have so received the correspondence. The issue would really be as to how you would want to treat the contents. In the event you're disputing the contents and that's where the entire list is before the court, then you would certainly not admit the truth of the contents, but dispute them. However, if you wish to admit the contents of a particular letter, it would continue to be the same, and you may do so in your evidence affidavit. As far as the point which I can see on the slide as to who can lead evidence, the issue is more or less covered by me, that it needs to be the author. In the event the author is not available or cannot step into the box for any reason, then at least someone who's aware of the transaction and who has participated and who's also aware of the contents can then lead evidence to try and prove the contents. However, in a given case, based on the facts and circumstances, it could run foul of the best evidence rule, and it would be open to a judge to consider how far would such a document be deemed to be proved at the final hearing stage.
So Rohan, sometimes what happens, a company is leading evidence and the employee who signed a particular document or a letter is no more available. So in that case, if the author has to step into the witness box, that won't be possible. So what are the options for a company to lead evidence in such cases?
Right. This is a critical element because in corporations or large companies, mostly there is a lot of employees who leave employment or change departments or whatever it may be. And many a times they are not available to lead evidence when a particular dispute arises and reaches the stage of evidence. In such cases, again, as I have mentioned, someone who's aware of the transaction or who can authoritatively say that he's aware of the contents of the documents, maybe was involved in negotiating the agreement, in case it's an agreement, or was involved in the team that set up the transaction or something of that sort. Maybe such a person can then step into the box and try and prove such a document. Additionally, the burden on such a person would be also to prove the fact that it was in fact signed by his predecessor or someone who he has succeeded, or some other person of his team who is no longer in employment. He would also have to prove his signature on the basis of the fact that he's seen the person sign, etc., which is covered under the Evidence Act. I guess it is section 47. Yes, it's 47, which allows a court to form an opinion as to the person by whom any document was written or signed, where someone can say that he's seen the person sign often and he's aware of the manner in which he signs documents, etc. So in these ways, probably there is a way out in such situations. Though again, as I said, depending on the facts and circumstances of each case, it may run foul of the best evidence rule and a court may look at it and not completely rely upon the document as being proved.
Suppose these original documents which we want to prove is not available, but a photocopy is available, which is the secondary evidence. So what averments are required and how do we prove documents which are photocopies and not originals?
So as far as I can see on the slide, yes, examples, photocopies of agreements, MOU, multi-party contracts, etc. Right. So more or less proving the existence and execution as also the contents would be the same as what I have already illustrated before. The only difference in this case would be the fact that all of this is really secondary evidence and would fall under section 63 and in which category it so falls. And a case would have to be made out as to why one wants to lead secondary evidence instead of the primary evidence, which case now it is settled law that it would have to be made out in the evidence affidavit or the pleadings. And it need not be made out by way of a separate application. The Bombay High Court had taken this view earlier, which is now in fact indirectly confirmed by the Honorable Supreme Court. So the law as at present is quite clear on this. Insofar as conditions for leading secondary evidence, one can have a look at section 65 and 66, which set out various instances when secondary evidence can be led. Commonly, it's done in instances where the original is with someone else and that other party on being given a notice to produce is not producing it or is unable to produce it, etc. Or if the original is very bulky and not possible to be arranged for physical examination in court, or it is simply lost or cannot be found after diligent search. So there are these instances when secondary evidence can be led. However, a specific case needs to be made out insofar as leading secondary evidence is concerned in the evidence affidavit. Apart from that, for proving existence, execution, and contents and truth of contents, it would more or less be the same as what we've already discussed.
So this is as far as physical documents are concerned, but now more and more documents are in electronic format or electronic records, what we call. So how do we use these principles to prove electronic documents? And further, what extra averments or care we need to take to prove these electronic documents such as emails or electronic agreements or secure electronic records, electronic signature certificates, and other documents like computer printouts?
Yes, sure. Now, as we all know that in these times, it's quite important to have most of the things digitized and all of that. So all these issues are going to arise time and again. If we take a simple example of an email, it's basically nothing other than a simple letter addressed by one person to another and at times marked a copy to various other persons. We look at emails for now. Again, so principles which are applicable to actually prove a letter would, in that sense, fall for an email as well. Except the fact that there would be one additional compliance which would be required, and that is the compliance under Section 65B. Because it would effectively, a printout of an email once tendered in evidence would effectively mean a secondary copy of that email, which is taken out from the computer and tendered in evidence. For this, the compliance under Section 65B would be required to be scrupulously followed. To put it in short, under Section 65B, what is essential is to ensure and to convince the court that the document that is being tendered is authentic and reflects the correct copy of what is stored in the physical computer. I mean, I would use the term physical computer for convenience. It's obviously a lot more nuanced otherwise under the Information Technology Act and the Evidence Act as well. But what one would have to look at effectively is that along with the Section 65B averments which can be made in the evidence affidavit, a certificate from the person who has control over the computer system would be required to effectively state that the computer system was under his control, it was never tampered with, the authenticity of all the records in it is maintained, the fact that it was working properly when the electronic record was stored in the system, when it was printed out, when it was actually prepared, at what stage were the printouts taken and how was the printer working, and that all the instruments were in fact working fine. And those specific averments are mentioned in fact in Section 65B itself. So once the compliance certificate is taken out, the essential thing to keep in mind would be that if the person who's leading evidence is the same person who has control over the computer system, then he can also identify his signature on the certificate, and that would make proving the contents of the certificate easy. Otherwise, in certain cases, there is an insistence on leading the evidence of the person who's actually in control of the system to ensure that the contents of the certificate itself are also proved. At times, there are such views taken. So one will have to keep that in mind. Apart from that, more or less, everything is the same for proving existence and execution. Just one thing though I would like to harp upon is electronic agreements. Now this is quite a novel thing, though it's been around for a few years. I think in the present times it's going to gain a lot of leverage these days. Electronic agreements are effectively documents that are executed directly on a computer device by people without having any physical engagement as such with paper. These documents are electronically signed, and the original copy as such is then in the server or the computer system. These agreements, when are required to be proved, effectively what will be tendered in court is a printout or a physical copy of that agreement. And therefore, it would also be necessary to take a look at what presumptions the Evidence Act provides in cases of electronic agreements or electronic signatures, etc., which obviously, as we all know, the Act is quite clear insofar as the authenticity of such documents and the fact that the electronic signature is the signature of an individual A, B, or C who has affixed such signature on the document is taken for, in that sense, to be presumed. So that is something that all of us need to keep in mind.
Any particular averments in the evidence affidavit apart from what is there for hard copies of documents?
So as I've already mentioned, amalgam of whatever we have discussed needs to find place in the evidence affidavit, including obviously the bare bone structure of Section 65B, which requires you to make those averments. It's always better on the safe side to have them in the evidence affidavit at least one place, which can then refer to all the electronic record that you wish to rely upon, provided it's being proved by the same witness. Apart from obviously the threadbare averments which would be required for proving each electronic record in the manner that would be relevant and deemed fit.
From the discussion over general documents, let us look at some specific documents that require to be proved. For example, documents that require attestation. How do we go about proving these particular documents?
Yes, so the principle of law is well set out in Section 68 to 72, as we can see on the slide. To put it in a nutshell, there are certain documents which are required by law to be attested, and such documents can be proved in evidence only and only if at least one of the attesting witness steps into the box and proves the execution of the document. Obviously, what the witness will say in his affidavit is that he has actually signed the document and seen the executor of the document actually sign it along with the other witness, and that all of them were physically present and have signed in the presence of each other. A standard example would be a will. Yes, it's mentioned in the slide here. Apart from this, there is a leeway given in the proviso to Section 68, which provides that in cases apart from a will, where a document which requires attestation is also registered, then such a document can be proved in evidence, and the existence and authenticity can be proved even without calling upon an attesting witness to actually step into the box. Now that becomes a little relevant because there are certain documents under the Transfer of Property Act that require attestation. So for example, a gift deed or a mortgage deed. In these documents, 99 out of 100 times, these documents are also registered, in which case, ideally, two witnesses affirm this and sign these documents. If a document is registered, and as we have discussed, in such cases, the witness need not be called upon to lead evidence, and they can be proved without the ordeal of trying to go through the witness and then subjecting him to cross. However, what one needs to also keep in mind is that in case of a will, this exception will not apply. And if a witness is available and is alive, he must, at least one of the witnesses must step into the box and prove the execution of the will. The other principle that I would like to harp upon is that out of abundant caution, certain parties execute documents and also attest them in presence of two or more witnesses, even though it is not specifically required by law to do so. So for example, a sale deed or say an agreement to sell. In these categories, when such a document is executed without it really being required by law to be attested, it is clearly provided for under the Act that such documents can be proved as if they have not been attested. So that would mean that no attesting witness would be required to lead evidence. However, there is a lot of law on the issue as to how one needs to prove a gift deed. And effectively, the entire genesis is that if the document is disputed by the other side, or not just the contents, but even the existence of the document is disputed, or there is a allegation of forgery or fabrication or coercion or something of the sort, then it would be incumbent on the plaintiff to in fact lead the evidence of an attesting witness if he is so available, to make out a further case to actually show that the execution of the document was properly made and there was no, to loosely use the word, hodgepodge as such. So to that extent, there is law which suggests that where an attesting witness is available, it's best to lead his evidence. So this is something that all of us also need to keep in mind.
Moving to the next type of document, a newspaper report. Now, at times there is defamation cases. There has to be a report, may have to be proved, a newspaper report. So how do we go about proving this specific document?
Okay, so the law insofar as newspaper reports is concerned is well settled for a while now. Basically, a simpliciter copy of a newspaper report is considered to be secondary hearsay evidence and is simply not admissible in court. A court will not take cognizance of something that is simply put in a newspaper and flashed in court to, or even tendered in court to come to any kind of a conclusion. However, the only way a newspaper report can be proved is by actually tendering in evidence the exact replica or the exact specimen newspaper which we get every day and one needs to rely on it. And by having the evidence of someone who is related to that, ideally the author of the report. So that is the newspaper journalist or whoever is on the ground who's taken that information and supplied it to his or her editor, needs to then step into the box and say as to how the contents that have found place in the newspaper report are in fact true and correct. Number one. Number two, it can also be proved by certain corroborative evidence of people. Say, for example, it's the record of a speech, which is then formulated as a newspaper report on the second or the third day after the speech. Then someone who is present in that public speech or that whatever gathering needs to then step into the box and say that yes, so-and-so speech did take place on so-and-so date and so-and-so was in fact said by the speaker. Just to highlight a couple of judgments which come to mind. One is that famous judgment of George Fernandez when he gave a speech at Shivaji Park. It's an old judgment, I think of 1969 or so. where it was reported in the Maratha on the next day, and there was this whole range of litigation which went around it. Certain useful principles have been culminated by the Supreme Court in that judgment, which have then been also followed subsequently in a 2004 judgment, as also in a 1988 Supreme Court. If I remember, I'm not able to recollect the citations, but at the end of the seminar, I'll help Makarand with the citations. You can then maybe post it in the box. But there are these judgments which talk about what is the exact evidentiary value of a newspaper report.
So moving on from private documents to public documents. Now, a lot of time litigation, various public documents like revenue records, 7/12 extracts, marriage and death certificates, decree, judgments of the civil court, then records of visa office, then things like register maintained by the sub registrar in his or office. So these documents required to be proved in a trial. Now, obviously, we can't get the original document from produce. So how do we go about producing public documents in a trial?
The most easy answer to this would be to produce certified copies, as is provided for under Section 76 onwards of the Evidence Act. Effectively, one would have to consider Section 76, 77, and 78. Obviously, read with Section 63(1), which talks about secondary evidence, and subsection 1 of Section 63 will provide that certified copies as and when permitted to be tendered in evidence by this Act. So effectively, when all of this is read together, and the fact that there is a presumption as to the genuineness of certified copies under Section 79, once a certified copy from the concerned department or authority is obtained and then tendered in evidence, most likely it should be marked in evidence as also considered to be proved insofar as the existence of that document is concerned, and the contents obviously will then be your burden as such. The person who's trying to rely on this document would be discharged. If someone else is trying to disprove or dispute the existence of such a document, it's for him to come out with his own evidence to show as to how it can be disproved. Because the term used in Section 79, if all of us take a look at it, is that the court shall presume to be genuine. So again, the term shall presume needs to be noted, and what we have seen and how the term shall presume is used in the Evidence Act. It means that in the event the other party who is not taking benefit of the presumption intends to dispute the document, he needs to lead evidence to ensure that such a fact is disproved. So till that time, it shall be presumed by the court that the contents as also the existence of the document are proved sufficiently. This is something that we need to also keep in mind.
So Rohan, any specific averments in the evidence affidavit to prove public documents?
Nothing really more than the basic fact that when was the application made to obtain a certified copy, and when you've received a response, and how you've obtained the certified copy, and the fact that the document being tendered is in fact a certified copy bearing the stamp of the concerned authority and bearing the date reflected, and whatever is on the face of the document needs to be narrated.
Okay.
And obviously the reason for actually leading evidence insofar as that document is concerned, which goes without saying.
Now, after the RTA Act was passed, there has been a spurt of applications to get government documents or documents from the government and use them in a trial. So this could be public documents or private documents which are obtained under the RTA Act, and they have to be proved in a trial. So how do we go about proving public and private documents under the RTA Act?
Yes. So there has been a divergence of judicial opinion insofar as the exact manner of tendering such documents in evidence is concerned. But more or less, the view taken is that these documents, once obtained under the RTI Act, don't really lose their original character simply because they've been obtained under the RTI Act. What really happens is you obtain a either a certified or a true copy from the concerned public authority. But the nature of the document being either a private or a public document does not really change. What really happens is that ultimately you will have to prove the document in the manner it is to be proved if it's a public or a private document. If you obtain a if you obtain a public document under the RTI Act from a concerned public authority, then that document would be proved if a certified copy of that document can be tendered in evidence, as what we have already discussed. In the event you obtain a private document from under the RTI Act, all that you would be required to do is actually prove it as if it's any other private document. The only difference would be that the source of the document would be established that it has been obtained under the RTI Act. In fact, there is a recent Bombay High Court judgment on this proposition, and in fact, it also goes into the issue of whether the document will lose its character, and it does hold that it does not. It's passed by Justice Naidu and reported in 2020 Volume 1, MHLJ 452. It's a recent judgment, and Justice Naidu has also dealt with the issue of how a private document and a public document will be required to be proved in their ordinary manner. Obviously, this judgment was passed in the instance where the court was looking at marking of documents. So really speaking, the threshold of proof and whether the document is relevant and what is its evidentiary value was not obviously examined. But it gives us a broad guideline as to how one needs to look at it. Though I am aware that there has been a judgment which takes a slightly different view in Madhya Pradesh. That judgment dealt with ideally a document obtained from a public authority being the local municipal corporation, and held that any copy obtained under the RTI Act can be immediately admissible in evidence. But again, as I said, these judgments have been tendered at the stage of admissibility of the document, and therefore, to be on the safe side, one needs to also consider the evidentiary value of these documents and how one can prove them through his or her evidence affidavit before coming to a conclusion that simply by tendering a copy it would be enough. So one needs to keep these things in mind.
The evidence affidavit, anything particular to be written for documents obtained under the RTI Act?
Well, ideally, it would be better if you set out the details of how you've made out the application under the RTI Act, obviously by tendering it in evidence as well, and the response that you've received, and in what manner you have actually received the document from the authority, which would be quite important to prove the authenticity. Apart from that, as we've already discussed, if it's a public document or a private document, all the relevant governments would be required to the extent you can.
I think we have covered a variety of documents, and there are many other type of documents, but what we will do now is to take some pointers on how to draft evidence affidavit, and thereafter leave the forum for questions.
Sure.
Rohan, any pointers you would like to give us on how to draft an effective evidence affidavit?
Yes, sure. So apart from the basic ones, which all of us know, I need not repeat it, that it needs to be concise, and the fact that it needs to be as clear and as crisp as possible. All that is a given. Just a few pointers that that all of us need to keep in mind is that the contents of the evidence affidavit cannot really go beyond the pleadings, that is the plain or the written statement. There is, the law is well settled on this proposition. Secondly, we should avoid having the evidence affidavit to be a narration of the plain or the written statement, because really speaking, what needs to be proved is very different from what you plead. You may make out a foundation in the pleadings, but your evidence in most circumstances is very different from your pleadings, and it ought to be. So if an evidence affidavit is just a replica of the pleadings by just changing some language and making cosmetic changes, it can leave a lot of room open to the cross-examiner to actually get hold of the witness and uh, sufficiently contradict his testimony in many cases. However, at the same time, what is essential from the pleadings must find place as well in the evidence affidavit to the extent it is required for proving something. So these are some pointers one must keep in mind. Also important is that an evidence affidavit must be prepared keeping in mind the witness involved. It is imperative that the witness whose evidence affidavit is being prepared is actually present when it is drawn, or at least has enough time to mull over it and read its content several times before it's actually filed in court. The reason simply being that a witness is the best person who knows his own facts better than most lawyers. So it's better he has enough time to read the contents of his evidence affidavit. Also, in the event you're leading a very limited witness, say for proving a very few number of documents, or is an expert witness for proving his own report or something of the sort, then by making loose statements in his affidavits, which go on to say that he's aware of the entire transaction or that he's aware of all the background and surrounding circumstances, it would be very difficult for the witness to then withstand cross, because he would be then open to a variety of questions in cross. So it would be important to limit each witness's evidence affidavit to the extent he's trying to prove facts or documents in a given scenario. And lastly, I can see on the screen is foundation for secondary evidence. I think we've covered it sufficiently before in the webinar, that foundation for secondary evidence needs to be laid in the evidence affidavit itself, and no separate application is required, and therefore that also needs to be kept in mind. Just a couple of points I would want to highlight beyond what is mentioned in the slide is that when one is drafting an evidence affidavit, it would be essential to have maybe a couple of conferences with the client or other the witness who's going to step into the box, just to understand the nature of the witness, whether he's comfortable answering questions and what is his demeanor and how is he able to conduct himself in terms of his own facts, and how he's able to consider and be articulate when he's thinking or even talking to you. This will be important because you may have to structure the evidence affidavit accordingly. If you find that the person is not that articulate and is not able to explain facts very well, it may be necessary then to flesh out the evidence affidavit to the extent possible to ensure that he is sufficiently cushioned for cross-examination. However, if the witness is well prepared and is able to articulate his facts well and is clear in his mind, then it might be also a relatively good idea to not flesh out the evidence affidavit to the extent to the hilt, just to ensure that he's not exposed to cross-examination unnecessarily. These are certain things that one can keep in mind. Obviously, it all depends on individual facts and circumstances, but broadly, these ideas can be made useful while undergoing the exercise.
So thank you, Rohan. That was quite elaborate and useful. Now we'll take
My pleasure.
questions.
Thank you, Makran.
So I request all of you to put your questions in the Zoom chat box. And also in the meantime, if you would like to receive the YouTube link and notification of our subsequent webinars, you can click on this URL. I will also post this URL in the chat box. If you click on this, a form will open where you can give your feedback on the webinar as well as put in your details so that we can contact you later. So going back to the questions, I'll just open the chat box now. Rohan, the first question is from Advocate Sagar. Is the acknowledgement copy primary or secondary evidence? I assume you are talking about a RPAD receipt or some kind of acknowledgement of a correspondence.
Can you please repeat the question, Makarand? I am not able to locate it in the chat box.
Yeah, the question is, acknowledgement copy is primary or secondary evidence?
But acknowledgement copy of what?
I assume it would be that of a RPAD letter, or it could be
If
of
it's
a
a
letter.
letter, no, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it means it's of an RPAD. I believe it seems to be of a letter. So any copy of a letter would necessarily be secondary evidence. However, an acknowledgement to the extent that it's received would help in proving the existence and degree of that particular.
Okay, so you're saying the acknowledgement copy would be secondary evidence, right?
Because ultimately it is a copy from what I understand in the question.
Okay. Advocate Asim asks, in bank recovery suits, the employees who executed the letter or agreement are not available when the suit is ripe for trial. How does the bank prove these documents?
So we have covered this in the webinar, I think, sufficiently. Probably this question was asked when those topics were not dealt with.
Yes, I think the subsequent question also, what if the author is deceased and the person who's aware of the transaction has resigned from the company? Can the person be called in the court to prove the transaction? I think this is also a similar question which you have answered, but would you just like to sum it up quickly in 2 or 3 sentences?
No, I guess I've sufficiently covered it in the webinar. It primarily means that your document may then, your evidence rather, may then run foul of the best evidence rule. If you're unable to locate the author or the person, inherent difficulties which can't be overcome without having one of them or someone aware of the transaction to be in the witness box.
There's one question by Advocate Snehal regarding a photograph about a
Which
negative not being
question?
available and photographer not being traceable.
Which this thing?
Is that 544?
Okay, I don't have it. 544. Okay, can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, in the old matter, how do we introduce critical photographs as documentary evidence if the negative is lost and the photographer is not traceable?
Again, inherent difficulties, because if the negative is present and available with you, it becomes primary evidence and the photograph is then a copy. In the absence of the negative, I mean, when the negative cannot be found and in the absence of the photographer, you at least then need to locate someone who was present when the photograph was taken or was physically present at that geographical location, who can then possibly lead evidence as to the physical photograph or the copy that you have. This is possibly a way out of it, but again, the question seems to be quite silent about who all were present and what exact nature, I mean, what was the exact nature of the photograph. So till that is clarified, it would be a little difficult to answer it.
Yeah, Advocate Asim asks, difference between exhibiting a document and proof of the document.
I guess I have again covered it, but just to sum it up, a document is exhibited when it is marked in evidence. However, proof of that document would be tested at the stage when the suit is finally heard and when the judge applies his mind to the entire facts and circumstances, including the evidentiary value of that particular document and how you have proved it.
Advocate Kiran's question is, if a petition speaks nothing about evidence, can the evidence be placed before the court at the time of tendering evidence? So what it means, I think, the pleadings do not have a foundation of the evidence.
I guess so. I think that is what the question suggests. It's a little difficult insofar as if there are no foundational pleadings to be found. But then if there is a semblance of any foundation to be found in the pleadings, then one can always try and introduce that evidence to correlate it to that foundation. But dehorse the foundation, it seems a little difficult. Unless and until you're able to amend the pleadings once trial has come in a subsequent case under Order 6 Rule 70. Though, I mean, it's again depending on the facts and circumstances.
Okay. It's an interesting question by Advocate Ayushya Kumar. Is it necessary to call an officer from the registration department to prove certified copy of a lease deed of a third party in a case?
Sorry, Makarand, I couldn't hear you. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. Which question is this?
This is at 6 p.m. Okay.
Again, I don't have. Sorry.
It's sent to me privately. I'll read it out.
Yes.
Is it necessary to call an officer from the registration department to prove certified copy of a lease deed of a third party in a case for establishing market rent for means profit, or a certified copy is sufficient?
Now again, in this situation, a lease deed between two private parties, though is a registered document, per se the document, that is the lease deed, will continue to be a private document, though it is registered. What will be the public document under the relevant provisions of the Act would be the entry which records the fact that such a lease deed is actually registered. So the entry in the sub-registrar's register, that index 2 or whatever it is called, would be the actual document which would be the public document. Now, if you have a certified copy of this index 2 which you're trying to produce in court, it would be plain and simple that it would be protected by the presumption which is applicable to public documents. Insofar as the lease deed is concerned, it being a private third-party document, it would have to be proved like any other private document. And under the Registration Act, the authorities which register documents, etc., are immune from being produced in court and to lead evidence insofar as certain aspects of their duties are concerned. There is a clear provision under the Registration Act which protects these authorities from being open to cross-examination. The underlying principle being that they are required to perform public duties, and otherwise each and every person will start calling these authorities to different civil courts for either cross or leading evidence. So to protect this eventuality, there is a provision under the Registration Act.
Okay. I'm just putting the link to the Google form in case you would like to fill it. Next question. What is the manner? This is Advocate Amrita. What is the manner to bring a new evidence if not sufficiently pleaded in the suit?
I guess I've just answered a similar question, that there has to be some foundation in the pleadings to lead that evidence. And insofar as any new evidence is concerned, if there is a foundation, you may do it. Otherwise, the only option would be to try and amend your pleadings at the stage once trial has commenced, which in itself is a difficult proposition. But otherwise, I don't see any other way of going about it.
If the evidence has come into existence after filing of the suit, say a subsequent event, then the plaint would have to be amended before the evidence is laid on that particular subsequent fact.
Unless and until there is a semblance of foundation in the pleadings without the amendment. Otherwise, for subsequent events, I would take it that an amendment brought sufficiently in time after the event has taken place should be allowed. Obviously subject to provisions of Order 6 Rule 17, etc.
There are some important documents like, say, I just remember, like bank statements, say. So how would you prove a bank statement in a trial?
In case of a bank statement, since you brought it up, Makaran, provisions of the Bankers Book Evidence Act would also become relevant, and especially I think section 4 of the enactment and the definition of certified copy under the enactment, where if someone wants to lead evidence of his bank statements, then it would have to be done by producing a certified copy of those bank statements along with a Bankers Book Evidence Act certificate, which is provided by the concerned branch, and then which also signifies that the authenticity of the record is in place and that it forms a copy of whatever is maintained by the bank, etc. And there are provisions under the Act which define a certified copy under the Bankers Book Evidence Act. And section 4 of that enactment also specifies that the fact that once such an entry is produced in court, a court can test it as if any other original entry was in fact tendered before it. And the bank employee need not step into the box to prove such documents. I guess if someone wants to lead evidence of the bank statements, of his own personal bank statements, this is something that can be done with sufficient averments in his evidence affidavit.
The question from Advocate Jennifer: in case of evidence affidavit being just a mere copy of the plaint, can the opposite side point the same to the court at that very point or at a later stage?
Though I would not see the sequitur to this question, to be very honest, because even if it is a copy, I mean, a mere copy of the pleadings, I do not see what the question is trying to drive at. Though I would assume that it means that can any objection be taken about such a document, about such a evidence affidavit rather. So the only way is to possibly cross-examine the witness, because otherwise I do not see any point of bringing it up before the court.
Rohan, what about books of accounts? Suppose a company wants to prove its books of accounts maintained by the company or various people or chartered accountants. How do we go about proving such documents?
Such books of accounts, Makaran, would essentially be like any other private document, because it's maintained by an individual of his own affairs or by a company of its own affairs, and therefore will have to be proved like any other private document by the author of the books of accounts or someone who's maintained it or under whose supervision it was maintained, to step into the box and lead evidence for it. Also, under section 34 of the Evidence Act, it's clearly covered that such statements of accounts or entries in books of accounts will have limited evidentiary value, because no third party or no defendant would be strapped with any liability simply by producing such books of accounts, because they are your personal books of accounts. The only way that liability can be affixed is by leading additional corroborative evidence to show that the contents of the entries are true and correct, and that such transactions had in fact taken place. Additionally, insofar as individual entries are concerned, if there are any statements which have been admitted by the other side or there has been any acknowledgement, then sufficiently such statements can be taken cognizance of and the court can always look at it. But obviously, principles under section 34 will apply.
Okay. Suppose a sale deed has been lost, only we have secondary evidence, or a photocopy of that sale deed, can we get any documents from the sub-registrar's office to further corroborate that sale deed?
Sorry, I have not followed your question, Makaran.
So the question was, suppose the sale deed is lost and we only have a photocopy. Can we ask for any documents from the sub-registrar's office where the sale deed was registered to further strengthen the evidence of that sale deed?
The only thing that can come to my mind immediately is that you may take a certified copy of the Index 2, which may be available with the concerned sub-registrar's office, which in fact records the registration of that particular sale deed, and which will then list out the details and the underlying transaction. That is something that you may obtain by making the appropriate application and paying the appropriate fees.
I think that's the question by Advocate Asim. The plaintiff files copies of documents of the defendant. These are admitted by the defendant during admission and denial stage. Whether such document, though not admitted by plaintiff, be exhibited and read in evidence.
Any kind of an admission would ensure that the document is, the document is necessarily marked, that goes without saying, and would also stand proved subject to a qualified admission. From what I take it here, the word used is admission. So I take it that the existence and the contents and everything that goes with the document is admitted.
Yes, I think what the question says is, can the plaintiff produce documents admitted by the defendant but not admitted by the plaintiff?
Again, the answer based on pure theory would be what I gave you. Now, if it turns on a particular case-to-case analysis, is something that I would not be able to opine or say anything on right now. But purely from a theory perspective, my answer would stand.
Advocate Bharat Mehta asks, when both parties lead evidence by way of chief and cross on documents tendered before an arbitrator, whether such documents are to be marked and treated as exhibited.
Now, as we all know, when proceedings are conducted before arbitrators, strict provisions of the Evidence Act are not applicable. However, principles which are enunciated from the Evidence Act do apply to such proceedings. And many a times it also depends upon how each arbitrator is conducting his proceedings and how he has whether set up any guidelines that he would follow, or the fact that both parties have agreed to a particular procedure to be followed. So one will have to check all of that and then ascertain the exact position. But on the face of the question, the way it stands, I guess the procedural aspects, the arbitrator is entirely free to choose, because ultimately marking of documents is procedural in nature, and nothing really substantively turns whether a document effectively is marked.
Okay. I think we are now at 6:23. We have overshot our time. So any closing remarks, Rohan, before we close?
No, I would just like to apologize if I've gone on and on for a bit too long, unless and until we are okay with the time.
No, I think it was very good. It was a detailed discussion. I think that is very necessary in a talk on Evidence Act, which is very technical by nature. So on behalf of all the participants and myself, I thank Rohan for giving his valuable time and enlightening us on various topics. relating to proving documents in a trial. And thank you to all the participants for joining us and asking us these questions and being a part of this discussion. I look forward to your participation in our upcoming webinars. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rohan.
Welcome, Makaran.